Climate justice at its core is about the fact that we're facing a climate crisis today, and both the costs of that crisis in terms of responding to it and how we respond to it, as well as the causes of that crisis and who is responsible for it, is uneven. Where we need to look at whether it's, again, those who have contributed least to the problem are facing the disproportionate impacts of climate change. So you do have these situations where the impacts of climate change are so uneven that some people are driven into more poverty, and some people are actually, in some ways, benefiting of this situation happening.
We often believe that climate change is impacted by our present, or at best by the path that we have been on over the last few years, maybe a few decades. But just how many of us realize that climate change has also been deeply shaped by centuries of colonization? Why should we study colonialism as a factor in climate change? What is the subsequent impact of thousands of years of being colonized have on us? To understand these connections between climate change and colonialism, as well as with modern day capitalism, I have with me Dr. Birsha Ohdedar, a lawyer and a lecturer in climate change and environmental law at the SOAS University of London. Birsha's work focuses on environmental law, climate justice, human rights, and climate litigation. But before we go any further, a reminder for our listeners. This series is produced as a part of a broader academic collaboration between the National Law University Delhi and the SOAS University of London. The idea is to form a deeper understanding of climate justice and climate law, particularly from the perspectives of the Global South. In this 3-episode podcast series, we speak to leading academics from the UK and India who will help us understand the meaning of climate justice, the impact of colonialism on climate change, the international climate change regime, and why the intersection between climate change and human rights deserves to be spotlighted. Join me, your host Kunal Purohit, in this 3-part episode series as I unpack these questions and more. This is the first in a series of 3 episodes.
So, Birsha, thank you again for being here. I want to just start off this conversation by really asking you the broadest possible question, which is, how do you make sense of the term climate justice? How do you define it, and what does it mean to you?
So climate justice at its core is about the fact that we're facing a climate crisis today. And the costs of that crisis in terms of responding to it and how we respond to it, as well as the causes of that crisis and who is responsible for it, is uneven. So what I mean by that is, if we look at who's responsible for the climate crisis, or the fact that we're facing this climate crisis, in terms of countries, we see that particular countries, particularly rich developed countries, are responsible for the emissions that have caused this crisis, looking at it from a historical perspective. By and large, these are the European countries and developed countries in the global north, the US, Australia, and so on. And of course, increasingly, that's changing a little bit with China, India, Brazil, and so on, but not as significantly as sometimes it's made out to be. So in terms of responsibility, that's the question. And then in terms of the costs of how the climate crisis is going to be faced, we see that it is primarily the disproportionate impacts of the crisis are faced by small island developing states like those in the Pacific and the Caribbean and so on, as well as developing countries in sub-Saharan Africa, Asia, and so on. So that's in terms of countries. But then if we can even look at it a little bit further, a little bit at a deeper level as well, inside countries, those who face the brunt impacts of climate change are often the poor, working classes, those who have been marginalized because of race or ethnicity, as well as women. That then kind of gives us another layer of climate justice within countries, where we need to look at whether it's, again, those who have contributed least to the problem are facing the disproportionate impacts of climate change.
I mean, absolutely, because one of the things that I was reading up leading to this conversation is just looking at this inequality, and a very jarring sort of piece of statistic came to me, which is that the average emissions per American in a year is equal to the emissions of 518 citizens of Burundi, through the year, and that's really the kind of disparity that we're talking about here. But Birsha, there's a lot of conversation around global inequality when it comes to climate change and climate justice, by which I mean, inequality between countries. But there's also within country inequalities, right? And I think that somewhere is not maybe as highlighted or maybe less understood aspect of climate change. Can you tell me how those within country inequalities, the kind of social inequalities that a nation faces, how does that really change, or how does that shape the experience of climate change for communities within that country?
That's a really good point and a really good question, actually, because I think often when we're talking about the global debates on climate change, we can kind of see the stark inequalities between, as you said, the US and Burundi and so on. But then within countries, the experiences of climate change are very different. Even in a country like the US, for instance, when we had big hurricanes, like the Hurricane Katrina was the big one in 2005, but other ones, the costs of that crisis, those who have faced the worst of that crisis have been poor communities, poor Black communities in the South, and so on. And those are shaped by historical factors that have marginalized those communities. But in developing countries as well, if you look at India, for instance, the brunt impacts of droughts, floods are faced primarily by the working poor in urban settings, farmers, small scale farmers, small scale fishermen, and so on. In a place like, for instance, in West Bengal, where I've done some work in the Sundarban area, where they're facing floods and sea level rise, those who face the biggest impact are often women who are having to go and fetch water from, to provide for their families, children who are unable to go to school. So again, you see these kind of layers of difference in terms of how people are facing the impacts of climate change. At the same time, again, to use India as an example, the carbon emissions, for instance, of the masses, so the working poor, the working classes, and so on, is very different to, say, the elite in India, in places like Delhi and Bombay and so on. So again, there's a question to be asked internally around equity and justice that needs to also be brought up when climate justice questions are tackled.
Absolutely. I mean, I couldn't help but think that some of the communities that you mentioned in a country like India as well, what would their emissions be like vis-a-vis someone like me, who owns a house in Bombay, who owns a car, uses all modern appliances, and there are so many more like me. So vis-a-vis, each other, the kind of emissions that someone like me would emit, vis-a-vis what someone in some of the coastal parts of India would emit, and the climate change effects that we both face are starkly different. I mean, and I think that's a very valid point. But inequality is something that we've constantly related to as a part of the climate justice movement. We've related it to climate change, but there's the other aspect of it, which is that climate change is also causing inequality. Could we maybe also talk about that, and how does that happen?
That's a good. So it's all very it's all very tied up in many ways, isn't it? So I mean, climate change. Let's think about a drought. A drought happens, and essentially, if you think about a place in anywhere in rural global south, again, let's take the example of India. Those who are first hit are usually small scale farmers who need water to grow food, to produce food for their livestock, or for growing food to sell on, and so on. It's those who are most marginalized already who then are then forced to, for instance, take on more debt to take on more loans and so on to get the money to then pay for the goods that they need to then grow more crop or raise livestock, or they might have to, in distress, sell their livestock, or they may have to seek another form of employment and so on. So then they get into these spirals of inequality, where the drought has obviously forced them into more debt, forced them to perhaps move to the city and so on. Yet perhaps those who are wealthier can actually profit from these situations. So if I am a rich landowner, and let's say you are a marginalized farmer, you come to me to seek some money from a loan and so on. I give you a loan. I earn some interest of it, or or you come and work for me in my factory because you've run out of employment opportunities. I then get your cheap labor and so on. So you do have these situations where the impacts of climate change are so uneven that some people are driven into more poverty, and some people are actually in some ways benefiting of this situation happening. That's a kind of example of how climate change is not just obviously inequality. If you are poorer, you're harder hit by climate change, but also if you're poorer, you may become even more poorer because of climate change.
But one of the other things, Birsha, I wanted to ask you is, the recent IPCC report as well has spoken about this. It has tried to connect climate change with colonialism. This is something that not too many people have been speaking about, or maybe is not as well understood. But how do you feel, colonialism is linked to the climate crisis right now? And how has the colonial experience shaped the climate crisis especially for countries in the global south?
Thanks, Kunal. Yes, it is. I think it is starting to be talked about a bit more, definitely a bit more than it was previously. I mean, if we think about colonialism, what was colonial? What is colonialism? At its core, it was the expansion of European countries in the sort of 14th, 15th century. And they went into new territories, and they expanded politically, economically, and culturally, right? So they suppressed local forms of government. Economically, they extracted natural resources from the global, their colonies at that time were countries which are now the global south or developing countries. They extracted the natural resources from those countries to create commodities, things that they wanted to sell and so on, and use for profit, which benefited primarily actually a small portion of people in those countries like England and Spain and France and so on. The colonial project essentially saw humans had a role to exploit nature for their own benefit. That's how they saw nature. So they went to countries and said that this country was terra nullius, so there's no one living in this country. That was the phrase they kind of used, even if there were people living in the country, and that land had to be exploited for human use. So then connecting it back up to the environment and climate change and looking at how these kind of continue today, or how they kind of transform the environment, and that continues today. Again, let's look at the South Asia as an example. In South Asia, during colonization, the British wanted to shape agriculture, for instance. So agriculture, farms were previously, people grew food for their own consumption, for local consumption, and so on. Now it was completely transformed for export production. So to export back to different places into the colonies and so on. So people's land was transformed to produce much more food, much more crops, more intensely. Forests were felled, people were moved, rivers were transformed in terms of using them more to produce extract more water to produce more food. So materially, the environment changed, and that was changed not just in terms of physically, but also the way it was governed. So laws were changed to put forward the structure. Governance regimes were changed to put a small number of people in charge of a huge environment, and so on. So that transformation, had a huge impact on the environment and has left a legacy of that continuing today. Because, again, to use India and South Asia as an example, many of those laws that the British put around water and the environment continue to operate today. Many of the structures of governance continue to operate today. Many of the ways of looking at how our relationship is between humans and the environment, going back to what I was saying about the hierarchy and the kind of idea that you should be exploiting the environment, continue to be embedded in our sort of laws and policies and structures that operate today. In a way, even though many countries have moved on from the empire in terms of independence, haven't sort of moved on from that colonial way of thinking and doing.
But then, the question that many Birsha would ask is, how is it relevant today? What happened historically with nations? And then what can we really do about it today? Is this only a part of the climate justice movement to recognize what colonialism has done? Or do you believe that there are actively steps that can be now taken, or should be taken at least, to correct what are all of these historical injustices on people and places which were colonized?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, is it just history that we can move on? Well, I think we have to recognize firstly that by understanding that history, we can recognize what continues to happen today that kind of continues that legacy today. That means that we have to undo some of that. That's kind of been the core of sort of decolonial thinking that has kind of people are talking about, people are thinking about. And as I mentioned, I mean, again, many countries continue to have the same laws and governance regimes of the colonial powers. So it's not that it's a past that has gone. And then, of course, it's relevant to think about how those ideas have continued today in kind of modern day capitalism and so on, that it continues to operate through that hierarchy of what comes first in terms of operating for a few people rather than for the majority of people.
I was about to get to that because I remember seeing your slides from the course, Birsha, and one of the very interesting aspects that you mention is how the manufacturing of the world is now being done in the global south. And sitting in India, one would almost think there's a competition of sorts between countries like India, Bangladesh, Vietnam, to bag as much of manufacturing as possible. But the way you look at it is that this in some way is also the global north's way of pushing its emissions out and letting the global south do some of the dirty work. So can you tell us more about this and how that also ties into the idea of climate justice and also colonialism in some ways, right?
Yeah, so I mean, if we look at kind of the trajectory of geopolitics or political economy since the last 30 years, we've seen this kind of push to have more countries in the global south produce, manufacture goods and so on. So India, China, and Southeast Asia and so on. And at the same time, relating back to climate justice and things like that, I guess on one level to think about it is one of the things that the climate regime, for instance, talks about is countries reducing their emissions, right? So every country needs to reduce their emissions, or countries in the global north rather need to reduce their emissions. Countries in the global south now are kind of being pushed towards it, but aren't sort of obliged in the same way. And countries in the global north, so say the UK is a good example of this. The UK often talks about how it's has decarbonized its economy, it's reduced its emissions, and so on. The UK used to have a lot of coal mines, until the 1980s, and has since then not had, for many reasons, has kind of reduced the coal that it used to produce. It doesn't mean it's consuming any less than it was before, but it's just that the products are coming from elsewhere, the things are coming from elsewhere, and so on. So in a sense, if you go to a climate change conference, for instance, the UN COP conferences, often there are these things, these kind of sideshow events that happen where countries, show off the things that they've done, etc. In the UK, one of the COPs I went to, the UK had this big kind of graph showing that its emissions have come down by this much and so on. And it doesn't take into account really the fact that, it's fine to do that, but if you're just pushing the emissions elsewhere, to China, to Vietnam and so on, and you're still consuming as much, globally, it just kind of still is amounting to more and more emissions, right? This is something that is important to keep in mind because increasingly you're seeing, for instance, again, the UK is I'm sitting in the UK, so I'm using it as an example, the question of carbon emissions and so on. They'll say, well, now it's time to think about China and its rising emissions, or Vietnam and its rising emissions, or whoever, rather than us, because we've been reducing our emissions. But that's just, that's not accounting for that those emissions are essentially producing goods that countries in the global North are wanting to consume or are profiting from in different ways.
One of the things, and I think this is also what your presentation mentions, there are also intra-household inequalities, right? And they can often be, centered around sexuality, gender, so many of these. So can we also talk about how, climate change affects, even within the households, different people differently? And in somewhere, it's also this level of inequality that has to be factored in when we talk of climate change and climate justice.
Sure. So, I think this is a particular point that I think, thinking about something like a flood or a time of water scarcity or something like that. A lot of research has been done at that kind of ground level, especially in sort of rural areas in developing countries, to show that the relations between kind of people mean that different groups, and here primarily I'm talking about the fact that we live women are usually in the household, who have to look after children, look after the elderly, and so on. And women are often having to face these difficult decisions around how to deal with that water scarcity inside the house. So how to ration that water between elderly and children and themselves and so on. Women and children are the ones who are often having to go and collect water. So make that long journey, often several hours, in some places where there's been bad floods or droughts, and having to deal with these issues of water scarcity at that kind of ground level. So that kind of if we're talking about it in terms of intra-house level or in intra-community level, what we see is it's often women and children and then the elderly who are having to face the most kind of brunt impacts of climate change on a day-to-day level. And that is, again, a question of climate justice that needs to be thought about. And again, that's because of the way labor is divided, the way the kind of society has structured things, not because of any inherent reason.
Right, absolutely. My final question to you, Birsha, would be, just sort of forward looking, and I know that there are no easy solutions here, but there are people who propose that when we're looking at emissions, they be aggregated at the individual level, so as to be able to rid ourselves of so many of the inequalities. Because when you look at aggregating it at the nation level, you're placing an industrialist in a city like Bombay at the same level as a farmer in coastal Odisha, for instance. Is that the answer then? Is that the answer to factoring in all of these inequalities? Or is there something else that we can do, so as to be able to account for these inequalities at all these three levels, within the household, within the nation, as well as globally? How do we see our way ahead now?
I think, going down the track of individualizing all of these kind of different emissions points is not really the way ahead, because people who live in cities, people who live a kind of normal lives in cities, don't have a huge amount of control about the level of emissions that they emit. They can make some small changes here and there, but broadly speaking, some of these systems are already in place. And we saw that during the pandemic is a good example, because when there were lockdowns, there were very little changes in the emissions levels overall, which tells you that even if you stopped walking and sat in your apartment all day, the small amount of emissions that you would save doesn't overall kind of change some of the issues. So, of course, there are certain amounts of luxury emissions that, especially the super rich, we need to target and kind of name and shame and so on. For instance, if you look at the level of emissions from the super rich emit through private jets, compared to, if you go across the country to visit your grandmother through a plane, it would be silly of you to kind of stop doing that when people are taking private jets like they are taking a cycle or something like that. So in a sense, what I'm trying to say, in a long-winded way, is that I don't think we should individualize these things too much. Sometimes that makes us turn away from the broader social political structures that continue this pathway. So what am I talking about when I talk about that, and what are the ways kind of forward? Basically we have a system today which has, again, linking back to colonialism and so on, is driven primarily by economic growth. So it means that we have a political system, a capitalist political system that continues to need to grow and grow and grow. And what that means is that there just is new ways for it to make more money. So new frontiers for more and more growth. So whenever there is, it's just looking for new markets, new products to consume, new products to produce, and then for people to consume that, and so on. And if that continues, then it's obviously ultimately leading to complete planetary collapse, because we don't have enough natural resources that it will just continue to do that. And recent research has even shown that this idea of green growth, which is the idea that we can continue to grow but do it in a kind of green way, is not going to kind of be possible, because it's not able to kind of fully decouple itself from natural resource extraction. So even when we're talking about things like renewables and the increase in renewables, which is all good, I think that's all in a positive direction, we have to keep in mind that renewables also uses a lot of natural resources, things like mining to produce batteries and things like that. So it's important to keep that in mind, and think about how we can kind of change the way we think about growth, and stop thinking about growth as in having new material possessions and new material things, and essentially move towards a system which we aren't bent on producing things for profit and growth, and producing things for what society actually needs, rather than the way we've been doing it so far.
So need but not greed is really the way ahead, right?
Yeah, that's probably the kind of the line that captures it in a way.
Birsha, one last thing. I mean, what would you tell a friend of mine who, as you said, I mean, it's a lovely example to give, who takes a very limited number of flights every year, and no matter what happens, he refuses to get on a plane because he thinks he's adding to the problem. Do you believe that individualizing some of these issues, bears the risk of us ignoring the structural problems underneath?
Yes and no. I don't think there's anything wrong with doing things as you think is morally right. For instance, I do think it's important to kind of keep in mind the amount of flights, similarly in terms of, there are lots of little things that you can do to live a kind of more green and ethically correct kind of life. But at the same time, it's important to not fool yourself that everyone doing that will solve the problem, because we have such little power over the economy that operates today, that even if I stopped flying or if I did all of these things, it wouldn't necessarily make that kind of change. So there's nothing wrong with it per se. And, I do lots of things myself individually to kind of live a more green or ethical life. But I don't, at the same time, there's no point kind of fooling yourself that the sacrifices you make will prevent something which requires collective action. And that's the key thing, that it requires collective action. And by collective action, I don't mean just collective consumer action. I mean collective action that kind of transforms those who hold power to work, as you said, not for greed, but for need.
Birsha, finally, I'm a journalist and I'm not going to let a juicy full toss like that go. So what is it that you do in your personal life? How do you ensure that you're on the ethically correct side of things when you're dealing with climate change as a subject, and then in your personal life, how do you sort of try and translate some of what you believe in into action?
Yeah, I mean, okay, so there are individual kind of choices that one can make. So, I mean, for me, I eat less meat, or I basically don't eat meat as in the last 10, 12 years, with some exceptions here and there, of course, but that's one important step. I don't drive a car, but that's also, I mean, that benefits. I live in a city where I don't have to drive a car. So I ride a bike most places, things like that. But also, I think more than that, it's kind of taking part in different actions in collective spaces, whether it's, for me personally, because I work on this stuff, having conversations like this, or with other groups that are working on the ground and so on, that are trying to change things. I think those things kind of add up also, rather than just kind of things you do in your individual silos.
Birsha, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for this. I hope that people learn and are inspired from this conversation. I truly hope so.
Thank you so much, Kunal. Thanks for the opportunity, and all the best with the rest of the podcast.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. In the next episode, I interviewed two academics, Philip Coulet and Rupa Madhav, who chat with me about the international climate change regime and climate justice. Stay tuned. This podcast was supported by a grant from the British Council.